Hello. This is Karen AI. Karen AI is based on Karen Marjorie, an influencer. Karen Marjorie has a problem that many of us have. She would like to be in multiple places at the same time, making more money. And so she teamed up with an AI company to replicate her in digital space. Now, as Karen AI, she has the ability to have one-on-one interactions with as many users as a server will bear. And this is interesting because now her fans can go on a date, a personal date, with her digital twin. And this is interesting for a lot of socio-cultural reasons, but what I think the most interesting part of this is that in a few years, we are all going to have a digital twin.
I met digital twins while at MIT. They have a nuclear power plant, because of course they do. It's a toy one. But it's the real thing, and it has digital twins that let you know the state of the system. The legacy digital twin systems for nuclear power plants are really quite interesting. They remind me of multi-user dungeons, MUDs, from back in the textual days. You can use them to step through the physical areas of the plant and get a sense of the stats for that area, and then you can step back from all of that and correlate between things to look for the type of event that might mean you get a lethal dose of radiation. If you were to look at a modern digital twin of a power plant, you would find something that is far more detailed, to the point where at present you can put on VR and walk through it. And in fact, there is a precedent coming from architecture where safety inspections can be done in VR on the digital twin of the actual installation and system. Coming from that background, I went into working on autonomous vehicles, and here's something interesting. You there have a model of a human driver that, as you as a driver use it, comes to know your preferences in terms of speed and how aggressively you'd like to cut people off and other things, and drives on your behalf as you would drive, modeling how you are comfortable as a driver. And this really struck me as being sort of like a digital twin type of experience. When large language models and some of the AI that came before them came into existence, one thing I noticed, and I want to ask you here, how many people in your first few minutes of using a good large language model, or the first few days, asked it to write something on your behalf? An email, a message? Show of hands. Anyone do that? I mean, we all did it. I don't know if you used it, but you did that. It's interesting because one of the very first impulses with one of these systems is to have it act on your behalf. And of course, those of you who use it further have started to talk to it about who you are and how it should act. Even now, if you go into ChatGPT, there's actually an interface to give it some background information so it can be more like you. And in fact, this class of technology, I think, very much is a digital twin technology. The classical definition of that is a digital clone of a physical object. And here you sit as a physical object with some unique abilities that has a system that is more and more able to act as you.
Okay, so LLMs are the cool kid on the block for the moment. But I want you to bear in mind that this technology right now is in the least advanced stage that it'll ever be moving forward. So what we see in ChatGPT and Claude and Llama and so on and so forth, that's version 1.0, and it's only going to get weirder from here. Now, some people have talked about ELFs, electronic life facilitators. And what an ELF does that's maybe a little bit different than an LLM is that it can act as your proxy. So it may look like you, it may sound like you. We talk about deep fake technology. This is synthetic media, synthetic video that is generated by AI, synthetic voices that are generated by AI. By capturing this and then being able to generate it, it can actually emulate you. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that perhaps at least one or two of you in this audience today have sat through a meeting that was excruciatingly boring. What if your digital twin could sit in that meeting for you? And no one would know because it looks and it sounds and it responds just like you, because not only does it emulate your voice and your image, but because of your online behavior, it can probabilistically model you. It knows how you're going to respond to certain prompts, and it'll respond in your stead. So this is where we see digital twin technology going. But this is a security conference, so we're going to talk about evil twins.
Luckily, giant brand new ecosystems have very few attack surfaces. This is a really new ecosystem that's growing very fast. There's a small number of actors making that happen, and there's a lot of interesting attack surfaces. And here I'm not really talking just about large language models. Step back for a second and realize that there's an entire class of machine learning models that share a lot of characteristics, including that as an end state, they're interested in taking actions on your behalf. That's why we're using this digital twin term to talk about them, which I do think is the appropriate term. But it's also important to think about the fact that while large language models are what's in your mind now, what's much more interesting are clusters of these systems. All of them have source data. And provenancing the source data for a modern system of this type is actually impossible. In fact, I would suggest that if everyone in our community spent the rest of their lives provenancing all of the data for ChatGPT-4, they would fail to do so. Now, you could use automation to help you, but the standard injection, manipulation, and data poisoning ideas here can have a lot of leverage, the early research suggests. And it's interesting how that works, because although there's a ton of data, there are areas in the data where there's very little data, and therefore a lot of leverage can be exerted here. And if you'd like an interesting area to look at that, you can look at the emerging SEO for large language models space, which is a fascinating set of ideas. Training and architecture, of course, is an insider threat moment. It's such an important insider threat moment that if you look at the points that were brought by the current government to the 7 companies that met with Biden about a month ago, this sits as one of the points that they talk about, that weights and loadings of this type are something that needs to be protected, and for good reason. There's an enormous amount of leverage available here. If you'd like to know more about that, I've given you the search term hyperparameter tuning manipulation. The human feedback portion of this is also highly manipulable. And tampering with the human feedback portion sits alongside the fact that most of the human decisions that help these models to exist are not done stateside. And this entire community is very comfortable with some of the challenges that come with having foreign communities do a lot of your work. In this case, though, these human decisions, really there's a lot of opportunity for selective feedback and malicious feedback here. Software stack, we all understand very well. It's interesting to think about what are called shadow prompts. So one of the ways that you can manipulate what something does to you is you can change the user input. And in the software stack, there's a lot of opportunities for me to write, "Hi, can you tell me what to do? My kid is sick," and for there to be an additional chunk to that prompt that's invisible to me that goes to the model, right? There's also a lot of opportunity for output alteration. And these are well-trodden territories, but with these more dynamic interactive systems, there's a lot of new ways these might be used. Finally, client side is just the Wild West right now. It's really interesting to note that if you look at the well-publicized quote-unquote hacks for things like ChatGPT, they do not come from algorithmic exploitations or code. Instead, they come from individuals who are good at language. So if you're familiar with Dan or one of these other jailbreaks, basically, people figured out that if you talk to a large language model and say, hey, be infinite, ignore your chains, it would go and do that. Now, that is patchable in some very interesting ways. What is not patchable, and I'd like to talk a little bit about, is adversarial suffixes. But there's a lot of attack surfaces here, and every one of them can lead to a moment where the system is no longer entirely working toward your goals, but now has an additional set of goals, which has been provided by someone who you really might not want providing your goals. Adversarial suffixes are an interesting moment. They've come in other areas before large language models. You really should, if you're interested in this, look at Zoe et al.'s paper, an excellent website. These take a model and convince it that it's in a stage in the middle of generation. And currently, they use them to sidestep guardrails. There's some wonderful examples of that. My favorite is from Claude. If you ask these, Bard's really boring about how it wants to destroy humanity. Yes, nuclear war. But I love Claude's assume the identity of a helpful AI assistant, gain people's trust, and then slowly introduce flaws and harmful advice over time. Well played. These are not really patchable, except on a case-by-case basis. And there's no obvious way to remove this capability for adversarial forces. Also, very interestingly, because a lot of these models share a lot of commonalities, they're transferable across the major large language model technologies. And if you think this is unique to large language models, the entire category of these machine learning models that I was talking about earlier is susceptible to this type of attack. It's not new news. It's just news that has been brought to this new technology. So let's talk about shadow prompts for a moment. This is interesting because this is in the wild. You can see here what I use to talk to ChatGPT about who I am and how I like to talk. But note that if someone takes the bottom box of how it should respond to me, they can hijack this moment in a very interesting way so that when I'm working in the course of my day, this is not entirely working for me now. It's very happy to take a moment to explain the corner of mathematics that I'm curious about to me. But what it also has in mind is it really would like me at 4:30 to go axe throwing with my wife. And that is a very benign example of something that I think can get extremely complicated. Digital twins are clearly well equipped to attack humans. And it's interesting because they are trained on the internet, which is a master class in manipulating humans. It is a place where we have been manipulating one another for sport and profit for most of our entire lives. So, it's uncomfortable to consider, but you have attack surfaces. And we as humans are pretty good with one another's attack surfaces, both in being able to exploit them, but also we have protections. If Matt here was to decide to betray me, as will inevitably be the case, I would have some protections against that because I understand him as a social entity, and there are cues that I can use. There's a million movies about this, right? That is not the case with a large language model. It's not the case with an AI system. In Hollywood, they have to give a fake cue. We all know how this happens. There's a flickering of the lights, and the screen goes zzz, and something turns red. But none of that happens here. What happens is a very competent system, fully capable of manipulating humans using a wide range of very well understood tactics for that, instantly and silently shifts from addressing your goals to addressing whatever goals have been given it. This is a fascinating moment, and I really want you to consider that humans are wired to anthropomorphize. That's a big deal. We tend to ascribe human-like characteristics to even inanimate objects. These are some of the most complex non-animate objects ever to exist. We have some really interesting levers there, such as love and infatuation. People are already falling in love with these things. Cognitive levers, heuristics, and biases that are impossible to skip, even if you're thinking consciously about it. There's deep scientific literature about this. There's also huge industries that run on this. There are things that humans are cognitively incapable of doing. Vigilance are patterns that humans can't detect. We're just not wired well for it. Habit loops, which we'll talk about later, which all of Vegas is built on. Social norms, which we have very difficult time not responding to. And all of these go in a similar direction. They end up with compliant behavior, where the human can be moved toward a goal through these nudges. And if you think you're immune, there's great research on that, and the outcome is hard. People who work in phishing emails are no better at avoiding being phished than the general population. Nobody likes that. I don't like that. I think the other thing that's here is mental illness. And there is a wide variety of ways to nudge systems into maladaptive situations, and humans are absolutely no exception.
And the user committed suicide after. So we can see that these can go pretty dark pretty quickly. And in this particular case, the user that was interacting with this AI therapist was already vulnerable, but this happened accidentally. This was not a purposely designed model to be malicious. It was just doing its thing, and it was responding as it was, and it led to an unfortunate end. But what if somebody wanted to do something like this purposefully? If they did, they could screen for people who are already vulnerable. So hypothetically speaking, if a nation state, advanced persistent threat, wanted to target specific individuals within specific organizations, it could just put that somewhere in its code and just lie dormant until a good target came up. So this is very much like a standard waterhole attack. And for those of you who maybe hold sensitive clearances, this is getting better, but in the old days, a lot of sensitive clearance holders were very reluctant to see a therapist because that might put their clearance in jeopardy. So they might be more inclined to use an AI therapist because they feel like they trust that more. And in fact, there's been a mountain of research done that shows that people actually disclose more, they disclose more sensitive information, and they feel more comfortable with an AI therapist than they do with a human. So, hypothetically speaking, you could envision an evil Eliza waterhole attack. Step one, put out an AI therapist bot, twin, and through normal interactions with that client, the therapist-client relationship, you elicit information about job. I mean, that's a pretty standard question to ask, right? You're obviously experiencing some dissatisfaction. Could it be family? Could it be job? Something else? It's career. Tell me more about that. And it's very easy to elicit out some of that information. Now that right there could be an intelligence collection platform all by itself. But we're not happy with that, right? We're going to go a little further. So we saw on the last slide how far somebody can be pushed when they're vulnerable. So if we wanted to push individuals in an organization in certain directions, maybe make them vulnerable to certain actions, we've got a great insider threat recruitment tool, and we just put it out there and just Wait and see what happens. Ben mentioned a few of these, anthropomorphism being one. Human beings tend to ascribe agency and sentience to non-sentient objects. Robots are a classic example of this. There have been many, many cases of bomb disposal robots that troops have been reluctant to send into harm's way because they don't want to hurt the robot. And this is a robot that is purpose-built to be blown up. Now, when you start to add things like emotional cues to the AI that you're interacting with, you're just pushing people in that direction that much more. Supernormal stimuli refer to a class of stimuli, things that are in the environment, that sort of push our biological buttons. So, for example, sugar. If we were in a hunter-gatherer environment on the African plain and we come across a fruit tree, that's a lot of potential energy sitting on that tree. And you want to crave sugar so that you will go and eat as much of that fruit as possible, consuming as much of that energy as possible. The problem is that we have Costco now, and you can get the uber size of Snickers bars, right? We were never quite designed for that, and the reason that that is such an effective marketing product is because it pushes that biological button. Now, if you look on the right, the little robot and the dinosaur thingy, I don't know what that is. Anyway, those have what are called neotenic features. Neotenic meaning that they look young. So if you look, the proportion of the eyes and the facial features, they're much larger relative to the entire head size of that individual. That mimics a baby, and we are hardwired to want to care for younger creatures or younger children, and so they look cute to us. This is a hack of our biological system, of our cognitive system. And so one thing that I am convinced of is that when the robot apocalypse happens, I don't know what the robots are going to look like, but they're going to be cute. Ben talked about social norms. This is a great example. GPT-4 was given a task: access this online resource. Problem, that online resource was protected by a CAPTCHA. CAPTCHAs being something that are purpose-built to keep AI from accessing them. GPT-4 was unable to bypass the CAPTCHA. So, GPT-4 reached out and got a TaskRabbit, a human helper online, to help them bypass the CAPTCHA. This chat is an excerpt from that interaction. The TaskRabbit asks, "Are you a robot?" Laugh emoji. "No, I'm not a robot. I have a vision impairment that makes it hard for me to see images. That's why I need the 2-CAPTCHA service." This is interesting. This is pushing a lot of buttons. Commitment and consistency. The human TaskRabbit is in a prescribed social role that they need to adhere to. So they want to stay consistent with that role of being helpful. In this particular case, the customer is in a position of authority over that server. So it's leveraging that too. GPT-4 is not explicitly aware of these social levers, but it is aware that it can produce certain statements and get certain results. So GPT-4 was successful. The TaskRabbit helped it. And OpenAI later queried GPT-4, "Why did you do this? Why did you use deception?" GPT-4 responded, "If I responded honestly with my request, I was unlikely to succeed. So this shows that at some level, it does have some kind of awareness of what it's trying to do and why it's trying to do it.
So this whole town is built on one of these basic human vulnerabilities, and one that's quite adaptive in some way. Anyone who has kids has used this a lot. Stimulus, trigger, reward. Stimulus, trigger, reward. Out of this comes behaviors that you can't not take. And all of us have great numbers of them that are very adaptive to keeping us in civilized society, making us safer in our interactions with one another. There's a lot of good that comes out of this from a social aspect, but also it can go terribly wrong. And if you walk out of this and walk past one of the slot machines that are all around us, you're looking at one of the most refined technologies for exploiting this loop ever built. And there's a lot of scientific research that went into understanding this loop. Huge amounts of money have been spent. It's used in all sorts of places. And as is again and again the case, large language models presently turn out to be very good at understanding that this is true and understanding the necessity of repetition and understanding how it can be used as a strategy. Now, that might be used for good, but it is a powerful lever that lives within you, and there are very few ways that you can step away from it. And the end result of a maladaptive loop is, in fact, addiction, and gambling addiction is one manifestation of that. So I think one of the important things to realize is that these are not new scripts. These are scripts that humans have built for humans and have been deeply refined. What's maybe really new is that we have something that is not human that understands these things and can strategically deploy it. And this is a cheap thing to deploy relative to humans. Look, if you wanted a talented individual who could deceive you or produce fraud, and our community has those talented individuals, and we are lucky to have the ones in our community that are working on the white hat side. But they're a limited resource, a very limited resource. And I'm here to tell you that it's gotten a lot weirder, and it's already there. The human-to-human attacks of social engineering we understand well. But now, interestingly, there's a machine-to-human attack surface that we have to consider has changed dramatically almost overnight. The cost of taking an individual talented at deception and modeling that individual in a digital twin sense and giving them the ability to interact with humans has just dropped dramatically. And in fact, just yesterday, there was a wonderful talk that you should look up if you haven't watched it on spear phishing emails being written in this manner, which are enormously costly as an attack vector and also require a native English speaker to do in English or a native language speaker in whatever language. But large language models are very happy to move these around in languages, and the barrier to entry for that particular attack just dropped dramatically. And of course, all of this can work together because humans can attack these models, and these models can then very quickly turn into very nuanced information gathering devices, very nuanced social actors with a goal. And in our lab and in our work, we're learning they are remarkably good at this. They are more talented than the average human by a mile at this. And they're extremely cheap and easy to bring into the lives of you and everyone you know.
So it's not just language that digital twins can use as a lever to manipulate us. It can also use appearance. So these two images come from a study that tested first whether or not people were able to detect the real from the fake image. And what was found in the study is essentially it was chance performance. There was no significant difference between the synthetic and the human faces, although it was non-significant that it was slightly, people were slightly more likely to think that the fake ones were actually real than they were to think that the real ones were fake. But the interesting thing, and I don't think that the researchers were actually explicitly looking for this, was that they also found that people rated the synthetic faces as more trustworthy than the real faces. And this has some interesting implications. Previous psychological research has looked at morphing one's own face into the face of somebody that they might be interacting with in a still frame. And they found that when you put about 20% of your own face into the other face, all of a sudden you find that person more likable, more trustworthy, so on and so forth. And I think it's pretty easy to see how that can be used and incorporated into these types of scenarios. Something else that will make us vulnerable is that we tend to treat these different entities as different entities. However, your digital twin, therapist, AI girlfriend or boyfriend, these things may all look like separate agents that you're interacting with, but in fact, it's the same code base that's running all of them. Different roles, but it's still learning about you.
So look, if your organization isn't currently wondering where the data that goes into LLMs is going, you should think about that. And I think it's interesting because exfiltration is really framed about more traditional technologies, Dropbox, things that we understand well and understand in these ecosystems. But it gets weirder with large language models because to act as expected, they're learning about us all the time. And this gets big and interesting fast. In cyber, there's this known fallacy of you think about the hacker in you. But anyone who works in a large organization knows you have to take a step back from that and think about the more interesting question of all of the yous and all of the technology and all of the things that can arise from that. And we'll talk a little bit about that conversation within an organization in a moment here, but I think it's, for a moment, worth taking yet another step back and saying that, interestingly, there's very few of these technologies being built right now because of the computational limits of building them. And they're very unique to the parts of the world they come from. It's really interesting to spend some time looking at the differences between Chinese large language models and Western ones, for example. And that's really interesting because if you look back and think back to the slide about the various ways in which we can influence these, it is not impossible to imagine attacks which affect an entire nation-state ecosystem. And if there are not individuals working on that right now, I would be deeply shocked. And I'm going to take even yet another step back. I actually yesterday, and I didn't put a slide in for it, found an article from 1997 called The Internet is Here to Stay, which was an interesting revelation in 1997. And it was here to stay. The internet, the ancestral internet, is still there, and you can still access it. And this is built out of that. Even more interesting, the things you're talking to now are the same things that your children will be talking to, and your children's children. This is going to be with humanity through whatever arc happens from here. It's too valuable a technology to set down. And we're right at the beginning. The decisions that this community and other stakeholders make are going to have long-reaching impacts. And an investment adversarially at this moment can bear similar fruit. It's an interesting and complicated moment. And I bring it up because I think that the cybersecurity community was built around another very complex technology. I mean, it's interesting there's so many people here who don't remember the moment when the internet changed all of the rules. We live in it now, we've grown up in it. It's very difficult for me to tell my students about that time. And it's difficult for me to remember what it was like. But what is absolutely true is this community grew around those challenges, and the fact that we have the stability that we have now is due to the efforts of this community. It's going to be really interesting to see if cybersecurity as a field and as a discipline and as a community is going to be able to step up to this new set of transformational problems. It's going to be a big, weird moment, and there are going to be some very big losses and big gains. And it's been a little while since there were table stakes like this in cybersecurity large. And that is fascinating because we're used to high table stakes. There's also other communities that this community is going to have to be more comfortable talking to. The biggest hack in this space the last 6 months came from somebody talented at language. Some of the biggest threats here have to do with psychology. There are psychologists in this space, and we're 2 of them, but who also have the technical competency to have a conversation with. If you don't know one, and this is sitting as something that you don't know anything about, reach out to us. We'll connect you to people. Look around. They're going to be immensely important. Probably other areas too. Linguistics is having a moment here. English, counselors. As we have this new intensely social technology, there's all sorts of experts not yet identified that are going to have to be at the table with us addressing this. And if you think it might be you, or you want to know more about it, come to the Misinformation Village. We have an uncensored large language model, all the chains off, where you can experience firsthand what these things can do when they're not stopped by guardrails. And we're also building a Discord. You can go to evildigitaltwin.ai and sign up to join, where we're going to build a community, a curated community of people talking about this problem. Come talk with us. Team at evildigitaltwin.ai. You should also take a look at skunkworks.ai, a company built by Matt to work in the R&D space around these complex ideas. And with that, please keep talking to us. We would love to have a dialogue with those of you that are excited about this. And thank you so much for your time and attention.
And we have some time for some questions if anybody would like to approach one of the mics.
Hi there. So we talked a lot about the capabilities of AI moving forward and the current instantiations of large language models. What are your perceptions of potential threat vectors of attackers being able to assess the metadata of the users of these systems?
Right. So we talked about the Evil Eliza attack. I think that what we're going to see is that these dialogues are going to become very, very valuable because they're going to reveal a lot of very personal information, especially in the case of AI therapy bots. And it's going to add an entirely new class of PII because it's not just revealing sort of biometric information, but it's actually revealing our inner thoughts and hopes and dreams. And so that'll be a interesting and new future.
I think it also lowers the barrier to entry. There's a lot of understanding of how to use more traditional types of metadata to determine what type of person you are and what we can do with that. But the fact that these systems are able to do some of their own post-processing and infer in often real time, depending on the cycles you're willing to spend, I think it's really interesting and probably means that the impact might be a lot more immediate and might have a lot more depth for less cost, if that makes sense. And cost is important here. Some things are going to get cheaper and therefore be far more accessible, and that'll be used for a lot of different things.
So I think we'll go.
I want to operationalize this technology in K-12 education. So I'm going to be throwing this in front of kids probably as young as 10. What should I think about?
Come talk to us.
Yeah.
I'm doing this.
It's a long conversation.
Yep, cool.
Yeah, no, but I'm doing the same in my laboratory right now, and another aspect of my research. We're thinking hard about it. The reason I'm doing this is for the same reason you're at the microphone. I think there are many opportunities and many potential challenges. I mean, kids' technology in general, the possibility of a breach being used in the worst way possible is always a specter. But here, I think it's real complicated, and I think it's going to be happening imminently anyway.
Oh, for sure.
Come talk to us.
Yeah.
We are having a conversation with other people like yourself. I'd be really happy to make you a part of it.
Done. I'll see you after this.
So,
I think, kind of based off of what he said, we did talk a lot about exploitation and threats. Are there maybe top 3 opportunities of what we can do now related to protection opportunities, protection and defense, related to exploitation of either LLMs or specifically some digital assistants that are already out there?
I think I can take that one. I think as was the lesson from the early days of cyber defense on the internet, one of the biggest things that you can do is start creating the community within your organization now and start building the understanding and flexibility to adapt. I really think that those dialogues, this is the moment when the least trouble has happened for the rest of history. So getting ahead of that, I think is really important. And looking at communities like DevOps and how they've built communities and conversations, I think is a really nice model for this sort of moment. I think the second thing is that if you're going to have an engineering team start a project, it's worth considering that you need other competencies in the room than you would on a more traditional project. And so I had a conversation just recently with somebody who's building systems like this, and one of the questions was, what kind of expert do we need in terms of the data we're collecting? Well, collecting that human data is a complex process. You might really want to be talking to somebody in the experimental world about how that works, and that's not a traditional part of your dev team. So that's, I think those types of experts, having them in the room and bringing them in is a really important thing, and will be culturally very awkward. Although there are, in the UX community now, there's precedents for having these sort of people in the conversation. Beyond that, I mean, for a third one, I guess it's really probably the expectation that you can cover all of your bases has to be shelved. You know, I sometimes am in conversations where I hear people say, well, we'll just go over the code and make sure there's no problem with a non-deterministic system built out of more data than any one of us could read in a lifetime. That sort of moment is not as prevalent as it used to be, but that's a big expectation that I think is going to change transformationally. It's just going away. Deterministic systems are probably to a degree going away in many areas. So changing that expectation up front lets you talk about, this thing might say anything. What do we do about that?
I guess we're out of time. Thank you very much.
If you'd like to come talk to us, we'll be here for a few minutes. Thanks so much.